Welcome to News in Context. I'm Gina Valeria. In this episode, we talk with Dr. Amber Boydstun, Associate Professor of Political Science at UC Davis and author of Making the News, about how media influence framing and attention. Dr. Boydstun and I explored how framing and attention are at play during the time of COVID-19. As we shelter in place, rely more and more on digital spaces for engagement and news, and navigate the ever-growing onslaught of information and misinformation delivered to us in our digital spaces. Welcome, Amber. It's great to have you on the show. All right, so to start, I would love to ask you, I was looking over, your book, your website's homepage, and I saw on the homepage that you mentioned political science is largely the study of how scarce resources get distributed, and you focus in on that limited resource of attention. So putting that frame onto the COVID-19 moment, what are your initial thoughts about what frames you think have been getting the most attention in media coverage?
The first thing to notice, I think, about the very appropriate high levels of attention that news outlets, the social media, that normal citizens have been giving to COVID-19 is that level of attention is both appropriate, and it means that it's sucking out all of the oxygen from the room, so that now we're not paying attention to any of the other things that are also deserving of our attention. We're no longer paying hardly any attention to the presidential election and the primary. We're not paying attention to what's happening in Syria. We're not paying attention to all of the other things that are still, all of the other challenges that are still going on in our country and around the world, from gun violence to mass migration. All of those things have dropped off the radar, and it makes perfect sense. And what that means, though, is that any momentum that some of those issues were getting in the news to lock on to our attention and to potentially shift the way that citizens think about things or what policies we put into place, all of that momentum is now lost. With regard to the types of attention that the COVID-19 pandemic has been receiving, it has been following the standard model of what I and co-authors in our research have called a media storm, where this was an unexpected pandemic, or at least the timing of it was unexpected, and news outlets lurched onto it as soon as they figured out that it was going to be a big deal, and citizens lurched their attention in lockstep. And we saw a rapid increase in attention for now a sustained period. And it would be hard to look back in history and find too many other recent examples of media storms that lasted as long as I expect this one will last. The only other point of comparison that comes to mind is the terrorist attacks of September 11th. Mm-hmm. But thinking about the specific frames that have been used, I haven't done any content analysis, but just as a normal observer, it seems that news outlets have been shifting from covering all of the facts, all of the scientific detail of the virus, to thinking about how politicians are handling it, to talking about the 3 things to do to keep your toddler entertained while you're sheltering in place, those kinds of things. I'm imagining that in newsrooms around the country, they're stressed because journalists are humans too, and so they're dealing with all of the things that the rest of us are dealing with. But it's also an especially difficult piece of news for journalists to cover, because there isn't a lot of new information day by day, except to give updated counts of this horror. And so that means that they don't have too many new angles to bring to the story. But we also don't want to look at anything else, except, of course, for those of us during those times in the day when we want to think about something else. And so we're very welcome to have the distracting news articles about the Kardashians or whatever it is. So that's all to say that in this media storm, we've seen fewer different ways of framing the issue than we normally do during a media storm, again, from my informal observation. But that makes a lot of sense because, again, there's not, the story is unfolding, but there aren't a lot of different angles to cover. It's really bad We don't have all the information yet to be able to forecast with any kind of certainty. And so news outlets are forced to give us the constant updates and to flesh out wherever they can any kind of political bickering or those how-to lists or any kind of other angles, but there's not a lot for them to work with. So I'm really feeling for them right now.
This feels like a moment where, the public is craving information and the media is trying to provide it. But it's also this moment where it's really coming into stark relief, the idea that what we've gotten used to with regard to information flow is we want to know everything right now. And though that hasn't always been possible, now we're seeing sort of the fracturing of that, because people want to know, how long does it last? When can I go outside? When can I do this? Give me a date. And we don't have the answers to those things yet. Something like this takes research. It takes study. It takes looking at data to start to form answers and then to evolve those answers as more data comes in. And that's not necessarily a place where the general public exists often. We certainly want information and we want it now. Though it does seem that people at least people where I am, again, anecdotally, people seem to have an understanding of that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we always want information right now, and especially during a pandemic when it's not just information for our curiosity's sake or because we want to track something important going on in the world, but also because we're concerned about our own health and safety and those of our loved ones. Normally, when we have some kind of situation unfolding in the world where people are hungry for information, that information comes relatively soon, and we have the attention span societally that we can hang on until we get that new information. The usual path that a media storm takes is that it's a surge of attention at the beginning when we as the public and journalists realize that there's some big thing to talk about. It gets talked about in all of the different ways. The situation unfolds in as many ways as it's going to unfold for the duration of our attention span. And then even if the situation hasn't resolved itself, at some point we lose interest, journalists lose interest, and we lurch to the other next big thing. What's challenging, one of the things that I talk about in my last book, is that there are some benefits to news cycles operating in this lurching fits and starts kind of dynamic. And yet there are also some downsides. And one of the downsides I argue in the book normatively is that when we as citizens have a pattern of information coming to us from news media that moves in this lurching pattern where all of a sudden everything that we're thinking about has to do with 9/11 or the Trayvon Martin shooting or whatever it is, our attention gets fixated to that. But then when it drops off the media radar, I worry, and I don't know that anyone has tested this, but I worry at least that it sends us as citizens a signal that that story is wrapped up, that thing that we were worried about, we don't need to worry about it anymore. And that's not the fault of news outlets per se. Their dynamics are fueled largely by what it is that we click on and by our consumer behavior. But in any case, we live in a world where we get these bursts of news about hot stories. And when it falls off the paper at the end of a media storm, I suspect that most citizens then drop it off of their internal radars as well.
It's true. When the media starts to diversify its coverage, which will come, that is taken as a signal subconsciously, like, oh, great, now I can go outside. I guess I'll go to the beach. Maybe it's not as bad as I thought because it's not at me 24/7. And that's a really important and powerful thing to remember, especially dealing with something like this.
That timeline for media storms, as I said, tends to be relatively short, that if something hooks the media agenda such that no matter which source you're looking at, you're seeing the same basic types of stories for a couple weeks, that's an eternity in the news industry. Looking back to the September 11th attacks, that media storm lasted about 3 months. That's monumental. I'm guessing that this one will last longer. One of the things that I'm worried about is that, of the many, many things that there are to be worried about, but as a scholar, one of the things that I'm worried about is that we have become accustomed as citizens, all of us, including Americans, to media storms that don't last that long. And I'm worried that in addition to becoming complacent about not washing our hands as frequently, we'll also become complacent about monitoring the news, either because we're just not used to having to attend to something for this long, or because we hit a saturation point where we just can't take it anymore.
I think back to 9/11 and the Paris attacks, but 9/11 in particular, that happened and it was profound. I was working in the news at that time. But when we started to pivot away from it or to diversify our coverage a bit, it wasn't going to necessarily lead to more death or anything like that.
Right.
Whereas this actually has a profound implication on public health. And that's something we haven't in living memory ever faced before. And that means that the way we engage, the dance between media and audience definitely has to be rethought. And I don't know, I wonder if we as a society are able to do that.
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, so a couple of thoughts. The first is that you're exactly right, that journalists that I've talked to echo exactly your experience, that after September 11th, there was a real reluctance to shift media attention away from this catastrophe that had shaken people around the world to their core, and that it felt disrespectful in some ways to shift attention away. But there wasn't a cost in safety to doing so. And this is very different, both in that there aren't the kinds of continuing unfurling of the story to allow journalists to sink their teeth into, to tell the story from lots of different ways, and that if they slip and shift to their coverage so that instead of 80% of the front page of each newspaper and the respective TV shows paying attention to the pandemic, only 50%, that really could result in people's lives being lost. But again, back to what we were talking about earlier, it's a genuinely challenging moral and logistical dilemma for news outlets, because there are only so many ways of writing the story about how you should be washing your hands frequently. There are only so many ways to put that, and there are only so many stories that you can write about family dynamics shifting and evolving during these shelter-in-place times, and there are only so many stories that you can write about whatever kind of political infighting might be happening or not happening at the White House or within the CDC. And after that, if there's no new information, if we don't have any new information about a potential vaccine or anything else, then it's just the updating of the death toll, which is important, and people will continue to click on it, but that's not enough to fuel 80% of the page going forward. So in the midst of this horrifying situation, it would still be academically fascinating to be in the room at those page one meetings at the news outlets around the world, getting a sense of what they're thinking, what their strategy is going forward. Because I'm sure that they're aware of this, that it's not just a matter of making sure that they've done their due diligence and telling us what we need to know, but that in some ways they probably feel a responsibility to continue to tell us every day so that we don't become complacent.
You're listening to News in Context. I'm Gina Valeria. Today, we're talking with Dr. Amber Boydstun, Associate Professor of Political Science at UC Davis and author of Making the News, about media framing and audience attention in a time of COVID-19. Well, the media has a responsibility to inform the public. But as far as the responsibility of, if we pivot, then the public's going to take that as a cue, I'm not sure the news media in general is thinking in those terms, because the news media in general is thinking about the critical role of informing the public and making sure the public has information and making sure they're holding power to account and making sure they're fact-checking, et cetera. It is going to be interesting to see that pivot. I also wanted to bring up the, you brought up the whole political dance that's going on, and there's a lot of, in the midst of what you what you said, this horror, but in the midst of this pandemic where lives are being lost and going to be lost, we have this political wrangling going on about which frame or, which narrative is going to win. And I've got to say that as as someone who sits in a privileged position and is able to sort of watch and analyze all of this without having to worry about my next meal, my next paycheck, my next roll of toilet paper, I'm saddened to see that that wrangling is going on, and that framing is that there is a struggle for framing when I would like to see us all come together, and that the framing is around things that are so critical as getting ventilators to hospitals and getting supplies to public healthcare workers. So I'm wondering if you'd be willing to address the idea of the battle for a narrative or the battle for framing that comes from those who have the mic.
When you say the battle for framing among those who have the mic, are you talking about journalists and editors, or are you talking about politicians?
Well, I'm talking about politicians primarily, and journalists and editors, I think, would play a role because as the gatekeepers, they would decide what to let through. So, for example, we have the president trying to frame the narrative as, he was always concerned when, of course, there's video to show that that's not true. We have news conferences being run live in their entirety across news outlets, which is generally the right thing to do. But those news conferences may contain incorrect or unverified information. And so all of a sudden, it's not only the role to air the news conference and analyze it, but there's an added role of moment by moment fact checking. And so there are politicians, various politicians seeking different frames. And of course, I'm thinking of the president, but even, the governor of New York, the governor of California are doing an objectively great job, but also thinking about this moment and how they and their efforts will be remembered in this moment. And then there are journalists who have to make the decisions about what information gets out there and how. So there are a lot of levels of this framing, but I do think that there's a little bit of a battle going on. And I'm thinking in particular of the president and the administration, but I think it's happening at all levels.
I think you're right. And I think that is politics as usual. I would be hard pressed to come up with any other crisis in recent memory where politicians at all levels weren't at minimum aware of the narrative that they were shaping, and in almost every case trying to influence that narrative. That's what they do as politicians. And what journalists do is, as you say, to gatekeep and try to let only the quality information through. But again, their goal is to give us all of the information, to give it to us from lots of different angles, and they need to fill the news hole. And so what that means is that at some point, we're usually going to get the many different angles that are coming through, and some of those narratives are going to be stronger than others. So I agree that it's unfortunate that in addition to trying to combat the virus, that there's also this political maneuvering. But that seems, it's maybe strange to say, but that seems to bring a little bit of normalcy to this situation. And so I don't know, I'm strangely comforted that I wonder if I mean this satirically, but I think that if all of a sudden everyone was getting along, it really would start to feel like the end of days.
Okay, that's completely fair. I think you make an excellent point. So there's some normalcy in our lives. Thank you, politicians, for being
Thank you, politicians, for being you.
There's another element of framing that I find fascinating, and so I'd love to throw it out there and see what you think. And this doesn't just come from this moment, but I'm seeing it in this moment. I remember. I'll start with an anecdote. Several years ago, I used to work at a news station here in the Bay Area, and we did a story. A colleague aired a story on an ad blocker software, and the framing of the story was businesses are very upset that this ad blocker is gaining traction because they're going to lose money, et cetera, et cetera. And I was also teaching at the time, and so I was thinking, gosh, that story won't resonate with my students at all, because to my students, an ad blocker is a godsend, right? It stops the ads from getting out at them while they're trying to, whatever, scroll or study or whatever. And so I always think about that, like that story, the audience for that, the frame was for a business audience, for an audience of small business owners or an audience of people who work in and derive their income from business. Whereas, the frame I might have written or a student newspaper might have written would have been totally different. With that frame in mind and watching the narratives of the COVID-19 pandemic, and certainly I recognize that I say this from somewhat of a privileged place. I am, still getting a paycheck. I'm still working, though remotely. I have everything I need. So far, everyone in my family is healthy, knock on wood. And the economic story here is quite critical and quite important. But there are other stories, I think, that are also important. And I feel so. I guess what I'm trying to say is I feel that economic story, the frame, is allowing a lot of political attention to go toward corporations and big business. And we saw in the wrangling of the bill at the beginning, there was a lot of relief directed toward major businesses, major corporations, and maybe not enough in some people's eyes toward the average everyday person who's being affected. I know this is a lot. I promise it's getting somewhere. But then, in my own experience going out for walks in my neighborhood, the air is so clear. I can see forever. And I'm like, wow, the environment is really healing in some ways, even though there are, with bad comes some good at some point. And so I think, there are other narratives here. And when we get through this, I would love for us to be able to think about all of the elements of it, not just the economic element. I'm not quite sure we will. But I wonder, and maybe the frames that I've got in my head right now aren't appropriate frames to be talking about. But I was wondering if you'd be willing to explore with me or comment on the aspect of framing with regard to who is getting or which elements of our society are getting the most attention versus those who might need more attention or more focus.
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, let me back up here and just note my perspective on the framing process. So if we define framing as describing an event or an issue or a cat or a dog, whatever it is, in one way at the necessary neglect of alternative ways that we could be describing that thing, that's framing. In my perspective, politicians intentionally frame all the time for really understandable reasons. It's very much in their interest, even if they are completely good-spirited and they genuinely got into office in order to advance the needs of their constituents. It's always going to be to their benefit and to their constituents' benefit to frame a given issue or a given policy consideration in a way that is going to best advance their particular cause. My sense is that journalists also intentionally frame, but not usually with that kind of political strategy in mind. Rather, they pick the angle of the story angle. I think you can correct me if I'm wrong. It's the phrase that journalists would use. They pick the
Yes.
angle that is most compelling or most novel or is going to be most informative to their constituents, to their readers or their audience. So we, again, always have this tension between the types of frames that politicians and other political actors are pushing quite strategically, and then the frames that journalists pick up in large part as a direct channeling of those or indexing of those frames that politicians are giving them, but also the frames that they're seeing, the different angles of the story that need to be told in order to inform and entertain and enlighten their audience. What I think what's interesting in this particular case, lots of things are interesting in this particular case. So the first thing that's interesting is that unlike other media storms, again, it does seem like there are fewer ways of thinking about this crisis than there have been lots of other crises. So I'm thinking, for example, about the Michael Brown shooting in Ferguson, Missouri, that there were so many different ways of entering that story. Some of them more and less beneficial to different political actors who were involved, and all of them of interest to audiences and thus to journalists. In this case, there really are, I think, a smaller number. I mean, this is a highly subjective way of thinking about it, but it does seem like there are fewer ways to enter this story. You can think about it from a public health perspective, you can think about it from a economic perspective, and you can think about it from a quality of life. The air is cleaner, environmental. I mean, there are those other ways of thinking about it, but it does seem like this is a rare media storm where there are really two main dominant narratives. One is about public health and one is about economic health. And so that's interesting right out of the gate. I'm guessing that if someone did a careful quantitative content analysis across lots of different news sources, that we would see both of those narratives, both of those frames come to light, as well as all of the other different angles, like family home dynamics during the shutdown and the quality of the air. And in fact, I've seen in just my normal citizen observation of the news, I've seen all of those frames at some point or another.
You make a great, I hadn't considered it until you just described it, but it is true. There are primarily two frames to this story, whereas other stories you can access from different ways. That was really enlightening for me to recognize. I would say, though, that within the economic frame, we could break that into subframes. And for me, the economic frame involves framing for large corporations, framing for the small business owner, framing for the worker who doesn't have any protections. And I think it would be a lot of fun to do a content analysis on those different frames on the other side of this, and also how this story was framed in other nations who faced crisis. I know it's too early and it's all anecdotal at this point, but once we move through this, if I'm able, I think that would be an incredible exploration.
The other thing of interest, as you note, is that these frames are different in the degree of attention that they focus on different segments of society. That if you're someone who, as I am, is privileged enough to have a steady paycheck and to not worry about toilet paper or how I'm going to pay the rent, and I don't have the type of job that requires me to have physical contact with other people, then of course I'm going to be more concerned about the public health element than the economic one. But there are so many people out there who aren't in the privileged position that I am, and they of course want to know about the economics. And those are not just people who are struggling financially, but also, of course, the big businesses. So that's an interesting development, and one that we've seen at other times. I'm thinking again about the Ferguson, Missouri media storm, and you could certainly argue that the different, more dominant narratives there shed different amounts of light on different types of populations. That was right at the start of the momentum of the Black Lives Matter movement, and so all of the discussion about Black Lives Matter and about racial injustice shined a light on communities of color, whereas all of the discussion about police safety and chain of command shined a light on police around the country. So this is not unprecedented, but it's, I think, made more acute, these divergent narratives against the backdrop of this political contest that we're in leading up to the presidential election in the fall.
Amber, thank you so much for being here and for the incredible discussion. We've been talking with Dr. Amber Boydstun, Associate Professor of Political Science at UC Davis and author of Making the News, about how media influence framing and attention. Next week, we'll air part 2 of our interview with Dr. Boydstun, focusing on social media and our own behavior as media audiences and consumers, and people connected to other people in communities. You have been listening to News in Context. Music in this episode includes Spring Fling by Track Tribe and The Heist by Silent Partner. In addition to hearing News in Context every Friday at 8:30 a.m. and 6:30 p.m. on KSFP 102.5 in San Francisco, you can hear it on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, YouTube, and PRX. We're also on Twitter at News in Context SF, and you can find links to all of that at newsincontext.net. I'm Gina Valeria. Thank you for listening.